Notification came while I was measuring flour. That's the detail I always come back to, not the words themselves, not what they meant. Just the fact that I was standing in my kitchen on a Sunday afternoon, trying to remember if I'd already added a cup or if I was still on the first one. When my phone lit up on the counter, I set down the measuring cup. I read the message. I picked the cup back up and kept going like nothing happened. That's what you do when you've been trained your whole life to keep going like nothing happened. My older brother had just gotten engaged. My mom's text said, "We're throwing Ryan an engagement dinner Friday. Your aunt is flying in. Please don't make this weird." I hadn't said a single word yet. I'm 31. I work as a physical therapist assistant. I have a husband named Will and a dog named Pretzel, and a house we spent 4 years saving for before we finally closed on it last spring. I also have a mother who has spent the better part of 3 decades making sure I understand exactly where I rank in this family. Ryan is older. Ryan is the one who got the college fund. Ryan is the one who got the car at 16. The security deposit paid on his first apartment, the down payment loan that my parents gave him at 0% interest, and then quietly forgave 2 years later. I know about the forgiveness because I overheard my dad on the phone with my uncle explaining it. When I asked my mom about it afterward, she said, "That's between us and your brother. It doesn't involve you." I was 26 at the time. I was also in the middle of paying back my own student loans without any help because, as my mother explained when I graduated, Ryan had needed more support getting started. He was sensitive. I was the capable one. Being called capable, I learned, is just a polite way of saying, "You're on your own." Will knew all of this before he married me. We had been together for 4 years, and he had watched my family's dynamics up close long enough to form some very clear opinions that he mostly kept to himself out of respect for me. He's from a family where people say what they mean and follow through on what they promise, and I think sometimes my family genuinely confused him the way a strange optical illusion confuses you. You know something is off, but you can't stop looking at it. We got married 2 years ago. Small wedding. Mostly his family and our friends because my mother had made it quietly clear that a big wedding would be a lot on the family right now, Ryan having just started a new job and all. I didn't push. I never pushed. But 6 months before the engagement dinner invitation, something changed. Will and I had bought the house. It was a 3-bedroom, 1.5 bath in a good school district, on a street with old oak trees that dropped acorns all over the driveway in the fall. We had scraped and saved and gone without vacations for 3 years to make it happen. The closing day, Will cried a little in the car. I did too. It felt like proof of something. That we were real. That we had built something. That it was ours. I made the mistake of telling my parents. Not a mistake because I shouldn't have been proud. A mistake because I forgot, for just a moment, what telling my parents good news actually feels like. My mom's response was, "Oh, that's nice. Ryan is looking at condos too, you know. In that new development on the north side, have you seen them? They're gorgeous. My dad said good location, though I heard that neighborhood has a flooding issue near the creek." Will was standing next to me when I read their texts. He didn't say anything. He just reached over and squeezed my hand. 2 weeks after we moved in, my parents called to ask if we could loan them $3,000. My dad had some unexpected dental work, and they were between paychecks in a way that was complicated to explain. I said I'd have to talk to Will. They said they understood, my mom added. At the end of the call, "We're so proud of you two for being so stable." Will and I talked about it. We were not in a position where $3,000 was nothing. We had just drained our savings for the down payment and closing costs. But they were my parents, and the request had that particular tone my mother uses that makes every favor sound like it's actually a test of your love. We lent them the money. They didn't pay it back. I gave it 4 months before I asked, gently, if there was a timeline. My mom said things were still tight. I said okay. I gave it 3 more months. My dad said they hadn't forgotten. I said okay again. By the time the engagement dinner invitation arrived, it had been 9 months and no one had mentioned it once. The dinner was on a Friday. Will had taken a day off work because we had plans that weekend. A friend's birthday, a thing we'd had on the calendar for 2 months. He was not particularly excited about rearranging everything to attend a family dinner where he would spend 3 hours watching my family celebrate Ryan, while asking me exactly one question about my life and then pivoting back to Ryan's plans. I told him he didn't have to go if he didn't want to. He said he'd go because I needed the backup. That was Will. That had always been Will. The dinner was at my parents' house. My aunt had flown in from Phoenix, which was a bigger deal than it sounds because my aunt and my mother are extremely close in a way that has always, subtly, excluded me. They have a shorthand. They finish each other's sentences. When I was younger, I used to try to insert myself into their conversations, and my aunt would smile at me with that particular brand of warmth that doesn't quite reach the eyes. Ryan arrived with his fiancée, a woman named Paige, who seemed genuinely nice and was clearly completely unaware of the family she was marrying into. She hugged me when we met and said she'd heard so much about me. I wanted to ask what specifically she'd heard, but I smiled and said the same back. The first hour was fine. My mom had made Ryan's favorite, pot roast, which she only ever makes for special occasions. Will ate quietly and asked Ryan questions about the proposal, which Ryan answered at length. I refilled my water glass twice. My aunt told a story about the time Ryan won a science fair in 5th grade. I sat across from Will, and occasionally we made eye contact in the way that couples do when they are surviving something together. Then my mom brought out the cake, a custom cake, with Ryan and Paige's names written across the top in gold, and my dad stood up and made a toast. He talked about how proud he was of Ryan. He talked about the family Ryan was building. He talked about legacy and love and the future. He did not mention me, or Will, or our house, or anything about our life. This was not unusual. This was Tuesday. But when my dad sat down, my aunt leaned across the table and said to my mom, in a voice she didn't bother to lower, "You must be so relieved he's finally settling down. You've put so much into that boy." And my mom said, "He's always been worth it." I heard Will set down his fork. I didn't look at him, I was looking at my plate. The pot roast was good. It had always been good. I wondered, distantly, if she would ever make my favorite for a special occasion. I could not think of a single time she had. After dinner, while Ryan and Paige were showing my aunt photos on Ryan's phone, I helped my mom clear the dishes. In the kitchen, she said, casually, that she and my dad had been thinking about Ryan and Paige's wedding, and that since they had helped Will and me with our wedding. I stopped. "You didn't help with our wedding," I said. She looked at me. "We contributed. You gave us $200 the week before the ceremony," I said. "We spent $40,000, she said. "Well, not everyone can be given everything, sweetheart." I stood there holding 2 dinner plates, and I thought about the $3,000. I thought about every time I had adjusted my expectations downward so the disappointment would land softer. I thought about all the times I had convinced myself it wasn't that bad. I put the plates in the sink. I walked back to the table. I told Will we should head out. In the car, he asked if I was okay. I said yes. He didn't push. He put on the radio and drove, and I watched the streetlights slide past the window and felt something clarify in my chest. Not anger, exactly. Something quieter and more certain than anger. The kind of feeling that comes when you finally stop arguing with what you've known for a long time. I didn't bring it up that night. I waited until we were home and the dog had been let out and we were sitting on the kitchen floor eating cereal at 11 p.m., the way we do sometimes when we're processing things. Then I told Will everything my mother had said. About contributing. About not everyone being given everything. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The $3,000. We need to talk about the $3,000. We talked about it. For a long time. Not fighting, just honest. Will pointed out, very calmly, that my parents had borrowed money from us 9 months ago, had not paid it back, had not mentioned it, and were now apparently planning to financially support Ryan's wedding. He asked me what I wanted to do. I said I didn't know. He said he'd support whatever I decided. I thought about that for a week. I thought about it while I was at work, while I was walking pretzel, while I was lying awake next to Will at 2 in the morning listening to him breathe. And then I sent my mom a text. It was not a long text. It said, "I've been thinking about the loan we gave you and Dad in March. It's been 9 months. I'd like to set up a repayment plan. Even something small, like $200 a month. Can we talk about it this week? She didn't respond that day. She didn't respond the next day either. On the third day, she called. She didn't say hello. She said, I can't believe you're doing this right now. Your brother just got engaged. This is supposed to be a happy time. I said, I know Ryan just got engaged. I'm happy for him. But the loan isn't connected to Ryan's engagement. She said, everything doesn't have to be about money. I said, I agree. That's why I'd like to stop having it be about money and get it resolved. She said, you know our situation. You know how tight things have been. I said, I know, which is why I suggested $200 a month. That's flexible. She said, your father is going to be very hurt by this. I said, okay. There was a pause. Then she said, I thought you were the one who didn't need anything from us. I sat with that sentence for a long time after we hung up. I don't need anything from us. That had been the whole story of my life, hadn't it? I was capable. I didn't need things. Ryan needed things, so Ryan got things. I was self-sufficient, so I could be left alone. The logic was so neat from the outside and so corrosive from the inside, because what it really meant was that any time I did have a need, I was violating the contract. I was stepping out of my role. My dad called the next day. He was more measured than my mom. He always is. But the message was the same. Things were tight. They hadn't forgotten. Could we please just get through the engagement season without making it complicated? I asked him, as gently as I knew how, whether they had any plan at all for repayment. He said he felt I was being aggressive. I said, I lent you $3,000. I asked once, nicely. That's not aggression, Dad. That's just a follow-up. He said he'd have to call me back. Will was in the other room when I hung up. I went and sat next to him on the couch. He put his arm around me. I said, I think I need to stop being the person who absorbs everything. He said, yeah, I know. I've been waiting for you to get there. I want to be fair here, because fairness matters to me, even when the people I'm being fair about haven't extended the same courtesy. My parents are not monsters. They are people who built a family with a set of assumptions about who needed what, and they never updated those assumptions, and the longer the pattern ran, the harder it became to see it for what it was. I think they genuinely believe they have been balanced. I think my mother genuinely does not understand why the pot roast thing hurt me. I think my dad genuinely believes he is a reasonable man. But intentions don't pay back loans. Intentions don't show up to things. And at some point, the gap between what people intend and what they actually do becomes the whole story. 3 weeks after the dinner, my brother called me. He was warm, in that way he sometimes is, when he wants something. He said he and Paige had been looking at venues, and that he'd talked to Mom and Dad about the wedding costs, and that they were hoping to do something really special, and that he knew Will and I were doing well financially. You know, with the house and everything, and he wondered if we might want to contribute. I asked what he meant by contribute. He said, like, be part of making this happen for us. Family, you know? I said, Ryan. Mom and Dad owe us $3,000. He was quiet. I said, we lent it to them in March. They haven't paid any of it back. He said, I didn't know that. I said, I believe you. Another pause. Then, that's really not great. I said, no. He said he'd talk to them. I said I appreciated that. We hung up on reasonable terms, which was something at least. My mother called me the next morning at 7 a.m. She said, how dare you tell your brother about the money? I said, why wouldn't I? She said, because that's between us. That's private. You had no right to bring him into it. I said, he called me and asked me to contribute to his wedding. I told him the relevant financial context. That seems completely appropriate. She said, this is exactly why I told your father you were difficult. And that difficult was the word that finally landed it all somewhere permanent for me. I had been called difficult my entire life for having normal human expectations. Difficult for asking about the car at 16. Difficult for asking about the college fund. Difficult for pointing out, at Thanksgiving 2019, that I had never once been asked what I wanted for dessert. Difficult now for asking about a loan I had given them in good faith with money Will and I had worked for years to save. I said, Mom, I'm going to need you to hear this. I'm not being difficult. I lent you money and I asked for it back. That is a normal thing for a person to do. I'm not going to apologize for it. She hung up. Will and I spent the next week deciding what we actually wanted our relationship with my family to look like going forward. Not in an angry way, in a clear way. We talked about what we were and weren't willing to absorb. We talked about what we would say if they asked us to attend things. We talked about the wedding and whether I wanted to be involved and what involvement would cost us emotionally. The honest answer was that I didn't know yet. I wanted to go to my brother's wedding. I liked Paige, but I also knew that participating meant re-entering a dynamic that had cost me a lot, and I wasn't willing to do that without something changing. My brother texted me about a week later. He said he'd talked to my parents. He said they were going to pay us back in installments, $300 a month starting next month. He said he was sorry that it had taken this long for it to come out. He said he hadn't known and that it wasn't okay. That text from my brother meant something to me. Not because it fixed anything, but because it was the first time in my memory that anyone in my family had looked at the way I'd been treated and said the words, "It wasn't okay." I showed Will. He read it and nodded slowly. Then he said, "That's a good sign. It doesn't undo everything, but it's a real thing." The first $300 payment arrived the following month. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. Tired in the way you feel when you've been holding something heavy for a very long time and you finally get to set it down, and your arms ache with the relief of it. I went to Ryan and Paige's engagement party. I brought a nice gift. I was warm to Paige, who is genuinely warm back, and who I think is going to be fine in this family because she has an instinct for navigating things without losing herself. My mom and I were civil in the way that people are civil when there is an understanding between them that certain things will not be said in public. My dad shook Will's hand and said it was good to see him. Will said the same. On the way home, Will asked if it had been hard. I said, "Less than I expected." He said, "That's growth." I said, "Or lowered expectations." He laughed. I laughed. Pretzel was waiting at the door when we got home, beside himself with joy, the way he always is, like we had been gone for years instead of 4 hours. I let him out. I stood in the backyard of the house that Will and I had bought with money we earned, in a neighborhood I had chosen, under a sky that was doing that late autumn thing where the cold makes the stars look sharper. And I thought about what my mother had said about me not needing anything from them. She was right, actually. I didn't need anything from them anymore. That used to be something they decided for me. Now it was something I was deciding for myself. That's the difference. Small from the outside, maybe, but it's the whole thing, from where I'm standing. There's a version of this story where I'm the villain. I know that. I borrowed from the narrative my family had built for 31 years, the one where I was capable, stable, fine, and I refused to keep playing my part. And when you stop playing your part in a story someone else wrote, they call it betrayal. But here's what I've had to sit with. Every single consequence my parents faced came directly from choices they made. They borrowed money and didn't pay it back. They told me I didn't need anything while budgeting for my brother's wedding. They called me difficult for asking a reasonable question. None of that was my doing. The discomfort they felt when I sent that text wasn't something I created. It was something that had always been there, just finally visible. That's the thing about patterns. They don't announce themselves. They just run, quietly, underneath everything, until one day you're standing in a kitchen holding 2 dinner plates and your mother says, "Not everyone can be given everything," and something in you goes still. Not sad, not angry, just clear. I think about Will a lot when I think about this story. Not because he fixed anything, but because he was the first person in my adult life who treated my needs like they were just as valid as anyone else's. He didn't make a big deal of it, he just did it, consistently, for years. And somewhere in that consistency, I started to learn what normal actually felt like. That's not a small thing. That's the whole foundation. The $3,000 was never really about the money. I think my brother understood that when he texted me to say it wasn't okay. The money was just the place, where everything that had never been said finally had a number attached to it. $3,000 of being told I didn't count. $3,000 of someone deciding my resources were available because I was the one who didn't need anything. When the first repayment arrived, I didn't celebrate. I just noted it, filed it away. Because the real work wasn't in getting the money back. It was in understanding what I was willing to carry going forward and what I wasn't. That's the decision that actually changes your life, not the dramatic moment, not the text you send. The quieter thing that comes after, when you sit down with your husband on the kitchen floor at 11 p.m. and say out loud, "I don't want to absorb everything anymore." Strength isn't the absence of hurt. I was hurt. I'd been hurt for years without fully naming it. Strength is what you do after you name it, whether you use it to punish people or whether you use it to build something better. I chose the second one, not because my family deserved my grace, but because I deserved a life that wasn't organized around managing their comfort. My mother said I didn't need anything from them. She was right. I just needed to be the one who decided that.